Who am I to speak about colonialism and why? If we understand our past and we have a chance to better understand our present, although I had heard the word colonialism before and thought I had a rough idea of what it meant, I was completely mistaken. Some time ago, while researching, I discovered frightening things about colonialism. The colonialism we're talking about is the one that occurred in the 1500s when various Eastern Europeans set sail for distant lands. There have been various types of colonialism throughout history, but what interests us is after 1500. An entire complex system developed in which Europeans subjugated the rest of the world. The primary goal of this system has always been the enrichment of the most powerful European states. They turned the decimation of people in distant lands, the seizure of their lands, and transformation of people into slaves, and the extraction of resources acquired in this way into a competition for profit. Today, the word colonialism often refers to this very specific system of exploitation. If you have never read anything about this subject and have only caught words flying around you, your first opinion might be that at some point, Europe developed technologically and conquered the rest of the world because it was very strong. Europeans were simply the best, and the rest of the people around the globe were somewhat weaker. So, inevitably, the civilians' force followed this course and spread the seeds of progress all around the world. Despite conflicts between Europeans and indigenous people, when you look at the big picture, railroads were built where there was nothing, right? Did the steam engine come to places where only paddles existed? Even in jest, the answer to this question is clearly no. European technology never left European lands, and whenever it was deployed, it was always under European control and interest. No one received anything as a gift. But let's say that it wasn't anyone's responsibility to give any gifts. That's fine. However, the problem arises when there is the pretense that by pursuing their own interests, Europe developed surrounding the world. This history is formulated as if for all the immense destruction caused by colonialism, the rest of the world should say, thank you very much. And here is where we need to stop. The point of discussing colonialism is not to ignite that ancient individual guilt, as that would be completely unproductive and confusing. Where would I have room to place blame for the fact that the English were legally turning people from Africa into their property 300 years ago? The feeling of individual guilt is a paralyzing perspective in which to process a history in which you did not choose to be part. So, beyond guilt, the reason why discussing colonialism today is essential is that the political and ideological structures born with the huge colonialism movement continue to drive the world today. And to answer the initial question, who am I and why am I talking about colonialism, the answer goes something like this. I'm a person who wants to know the past and understand the present. For those interested in the history like me or those who want to understand the present, this topic today is something that will change your idea of colonialism, and you will be surprised by the revelations to come. The modern man operates based on notions and measures called neoliberal, and I have used this term throughout the clips. If these are non-liberal, then what are really liberal measures, and where did they come from? The word liberal automatically sounds good because it is built on the word free, and who doesn't want to be free? But the original liberalism is not the one we have today. Born with the massive development of colonialism in the 1700s, liberalism, with its obsession with freedom, emerged in parallel with the vastest system of slavery that has ever existed on this earth. Although it seems so, there is no contradiction here. The people fiercely fighting for freedom were usually educated white men, wealthy aristocrats discussing increasingly complex philosophies to guarantee their sacred right to private property. Among all private properties, slaves were at the forefront, so the freedom to have slaves was an essential point in the conversation. The Declaration of Independence of America in 1776 begins with the very emotional words,
"We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are known by the Creator with inalienable inalienability rights. That among this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, absolutely superb, isn't it?"
That's how the moment looked when this supreme liberation of humanity was signed, and only 34 out of 47 people in the image owned slaves. This was not just what could be called a coincidence. Among the first 16 presidents of America, 12 were slaveholders. Their incomes came from the fact that they owned, under the title of property, a bunch of people who worked for them for free until they died, and were replaced by others who worked until they died. So, although as marketing slogan this beginning of Declaration of Independence worked wonderfully, it was actually based on some very non-obvious definitions of these equal people where and what freedom means. Non-obvious now, because back then they were evident enough not to burden the text with the specification that people strictly meant wealthy white men. I would like not to have to say white, but unfortunately, skin color, the number of properties owned, and male gender were very clear conditions for those who could benefit from those undeniable rights. They were by no means meant for everyone, and the extent that they expanded for untainted people. Initially, this always happened through intense struggles, as we will see. There were enough people who even in this context insisted that all people are different regardless of skin color, but they were considered absurd, radical fanatics making a fuss. In the efforts of these aristocrats to scientifically justify why Americans were only capable of slavery, a clear heritage was established where the white man was at the top, and any deviation from the shade seriously questioned one's humanity.
You say you wanna be a star, but the city is so dense and loaded. You need to cover up your scars, and it makes you feel so distant with such a disguise. Why don't you leave it all behind?
This is the exact point where European racial thinking is constructed step by step, which ultimately directly culminates in Nazism. Let's explore this evolution because I found it particularly revealing how it develops into Nazi logic, which didn't just appear out of nowhere and was methodically developed over 200 years by the brightest European minds. Meanwhile, in Europe, by the mid-1800s, it became somewhat aesthetically displeasing to own slaves, so liberal philosophy shifted towards the importance of having workers who looked like slaves. Introducing this new perspective was well received, namely that they weren't slaves in the ritual sense, just like slave, and it was considered a major European moral victory and one of those civilizational achievements. We take pride in it today, therefore this dubious legacy of colonial liberalism packaged today in the form of neoliberal nations is particularly important to understand because it is the source of our freedom with all its flaws and advantages. Then, all these slaves who created the new Western wealthy class didn't fall from the sky. They were actually people kidnapped from their continents or subjugated in their homes. These people who were thrown into European man's grinder that ingested people at one end and spit out profits at the other, still strongly feel the effects on this history today. In Europe, you can wake up one day and say, hey, sorry for all those hundreds of years of slavery and exploitation. This has no effect on the affected areas. Despite the seemingly miraculous healing power of accepting guilt, it does not solve overnight the problems of the systematic destruction of local communities. Division and underdevelopment of controlled territories were key goals in the colonialist system, and they were pursued with maximum intent. Division so that a critical mass does not gather against you, and underdevelopment so that you can keep people constantly under your control, under which an opportunity for any dramatic change never arises. The histories of these places colonized by European powers are atrocious. Some of the most cruel things imaginable among humans happened here. But they are not talked about because they occurred in these distant and dubious places and practically dismissed, unfortunately, for the people in those places. Just so you know, they do matter. Their history is an unwritten, irrelevant history because the story of European civilization, which generously disturbed progress left and right, defining Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. That's it. What can you do? We have no faintest idea how we got here, but we must accept this terrible fact. So, the reason we're having this discussion is because a popular and possible question is, did colonization mean the empatization of the world? No, it meant destruction that could be destroyed and then chronic underdevelopment of the remains in ways that still determine the dynamics of the world today. What did it mean to transform humanity into a monologue held in a single voice, namely the voice of money? If there could ever be any fair cooperation among the peoples of this globe, it cannot ignore this history of colonization because its effects have not ceased. Wherever the colonization powers withdrew, they left room for economic control of the regions. The few countries that managed to develop despite these conditions are the exceptions. In the 1960s and 1970s, the revelation was that you didn't need soldiers on the ground to control a poor and divided state. You could simply do it remotely through the power of capital. This is where the concept of neo-colonialism is born, which becomes synonymous with global neoliberal capitalism. A vicious circle is formed in which vulnerable countries are forced to sell their local resources cheaply, such as oil or minerals. These are processed in wealthy countries, and then the finished products are made from their own resources are brought back at a high price. If there's no disruption in the cycle, then there's no reason to allow for the development of industries and means to locally capitalize on the resources. It is deeply in the interest of the explanatory entity for these are not to be this respite, as they would no longer be able to buy the resources cheaply. Profits would decrease, and if there's no law in our world, it's that profit cannot decrease between colonialism and neo-colonialism. There was no such respite for most countries to stand on their own and develop such sufficiency to build a somewhat functional society. That was the perhaps dizzying introduction. We'll revisit all these things and more, but first, let's start from the beginning. What follows is a leap from iceberg to highlight at least some of the essentials in this complicated history. Dramatically missing from it is the colonialism that happened in Asia because it was becoming too overwhelming. Yes, I know many things are missing, but my intention is to provide some clear general coordinates that can be condensed within this undoubtedly very long video. In school, we read this paragraph. The consequences of geographical discoveries, the main effect of European expansion, would be the conquest of colonization and the exploitation of the lands discovered through the formation of colonial empires.
The consequences of geographical discoveries, the main effect of Europe expansion, would be the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of the lands discovered through the formation of colonial empires.
This process led to a true economic globalization for the first time. The European economy was affirmed on a global scale. The flourishing grand trade moved from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, which became the commercial axis for the world, favoring the coastal countries, Spain, Portugal, and Netherlands, England, and France, becoming economic and commercial powers. A European summary of 300 years of colonialism. This paragraph is perfectly representative. Europe became a major player due to the new territories discovered, which practically didn't exist before. One sentence that is again perfectly representative, making burst into laughter, can be found in the year 12 in the school textbook and goes something like this.
In the 7th century, through the expedition of Abel Tasman, the Dutch discovered New Holland, Tasmania, and New Zealand.
And that's how it could leave you with the impression that it actually was. At some point, European navigators got into boats and it seemed like there was nothing around, when suddenly the Dutch came across New Holland. The French spectacularly found New France, and the English found New Zealand. In practice, it was hiding all this time. There is nothing factually wrong in the sentence from the textbook. Australia, where around 1 million people lived at the time, was called New Holland. When the Dutch arrived, this language fundamentally instills you, from a young age, the idea that where there was no Europeans, there was nothing. When, in fact, there were people, but because of the Europeans decided that the land they found was theirs, they had the power. All these territories were vast deserts waiting for the European seed. No people lived there, because if there were people, no Europeans, there can be people. The next sentence from the textbook is, in all these areas, the aborigines were disposed of with their lands and forced to retreat to regions unsuitable for their traditional way of life. Sometimes, the aborigines were granted similar rights to the whites only in the 20th century. This last sentence, I assume, implies that sometimes they were granted similar rights, and other times they were granted not any at all. There were several such sentences in year 12 about how the indigenous people weren't quite happy with what was happening. plus scattered mentions from time to time regarding the slave trade in Africa, which apparently was essential for this true economic globalization. So, let's begin unpacking these sentences. The ceremonial starting point of colonialism is considered to be the moment in 1492 when Christopher Columbus discovered America. He never actually reached North America. Instead, he landed on islands off his coast, Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti in its first two voyages, then a bit of Central and South America in his last two voyages. At this point in history, it was clear that the Earth is round, but it wasn't known that if you got into a boat and sailed west, there were a whole different continents between Europe and Asia. However, upon reaching these previously known territories, Columbus set the tone for the next few centuries of colonialism. He described the encounter in his journal.
They bought parrots and bowls of cotton, spears made from other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They did not bear arms, and do not know them. For I saw them swear, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron, their spears are made of cane. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want.
And that's exactly what he did. The textbook from year 10 tells us up to what point this naval trade was centered around the Mediterranean Sea because it was served as the route for goods from Asia to reach commercial centers like Venice. However, in 1153, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople and exerted control over the area. Hence, Europeans developed a concrete interest in finding new trade routes to Asia that didn't go through the Muslim world. Columbus's voyages were part of his new effort. He convinced the king and queen of Spain that he could reach Asia, where there were rumored to be the vast gold fields. You just had to bend down and pick it up and bring it. Without knowing exactly where he had arrived, Columbus started to carry out his mission. The people he encountered on his first island were called the Taino, and they lived in communal buildings, culturalized maize and potatoes, waved food, and many games, and generally went out about their lives. They didn't have iron, but had small earrings made of gold. Seeing the earrings, Columbus set out to capture and torture indigenous people to lend them the source of the riches. He spent several weeks searching for gold without much success in the Bahamas, Cuba, and the island he named Hispaniola, which is now divided into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The gold fields stubbornly refused to show themselves. Upon returning to Spain, Columbus reported that he had found an island off China full of precious materials, fertile land, and native indigenous people. He described them as
so naive and so free with their possessions, though no one has ever not witnessed them will believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone.
As a result, Columbus said he could bring some of them back to Europe as slaves, and asked for men and ships. In his first voyage, Columbus set sail with 3 ships and 86 men. In the second, he was given 17 ships and 1,200 men. Once they reached the island, they began to abduct people to take back to the king. When the rumor spread among the local communities about what was happening, the indigenous people fled and abandoned their villages. Columbus often found them empty despite his efforts. They didn't find much gold, so they had to compensate with slaves. They gathered 1,500 people, selected the most apparently fit 500 among them for delivery. 200 died on the way, 300 made it to Spain, and sold into markets by an archishop. Columbus noted in his journal,
"Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold."
Due to the conditions, many of the 300 trustworthy people died shortly after, so eyebrows began to be raised in Columbus's direction. He had promised great things, but only sent people who died. Faced with these pressures, Columbus established a regime of terror where each individual had to collect a certain amount of gold every month. Otherwise, their hands were cut off and they were left to die. Since the task was impossible because it doesn't grow on trees, mutilations became daily matter, practiced even for amusement, to pass the time. The efforts then involved into capturing as many local people as possible and putting them to work in so-called gold mines, which often involved desperately searching for gold among rocks continuously until you died. It's estimated that every 6 months, about a third of the people forced to work this way would die. There's a debate about how the Spaniards managed to produce genocide in the local populations on the islands and in the Americas. Was it because of slavery or because of diseases? After decades of arguments, it's now quite evident that these two things work perfectly together. People were made vulnerable by the brutal conditions they were forced to live in, making them more susceptible for diseases. Because they were chased by the Spaniards, they gathered in unusual ways to facilitate the transmission of diseases, all the while dying of hunger. Estimates regarding how many people were on the island of Hispaniola before Columbus arrived vary between tens of thousands and several hundreds of thousands. What's clear, however, is that just after about 50 years, only a few hundreds were left. In the case of the Spanish Caribbean, for example, it's quite clear that the majority of the population had already been decimated before the first smallpox epidemic in 1518. The local people attempted to resist in 1018, but the Spaniards had swords and horses, so the resistance was defeated quite easily. When it became evident that resistance was futile, people began to commit mass suicide out of terror, so as to not fall prey to the Spaniards, who dismembered and burned them, among other extremely gruesome acts. That's how the first contact with the New World looked. That's how the civilization of the barbarians in the New World began, in Mexico and Peru, and where the Aztec and Incan empires were. Here, the situation was a bit more complicated because there was complex societies already amid political tensions. They were exploited by European visitors who brought diseases that immediately killed their leaders, triggering numerous civil wars. In any case, the result ultimately was the same. The decimation of the population and the subjugation of those who remained, in a way that decimated the population even further. Estimates regarding how many people were in the American continents before Columbus arrived vary dramatically between 10 million and 110 million, because it's extremely hard to determine. The widely accepted midpoint is that there are about 60 million locals spread across North and South America. At that time, this meant 10% of the world's population. By 1600, only about 6 million of them remained. So, many people died in such a short period that it seems the planet's temperature dropped a bit. This is because the lands they cultivated were taken over by a new vegetation that absorbed enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to cool down the planet a bit. Given the situation, the Spaniards found themselves rulers of the land where there weren't enough enslaved hands to exploit. So, for this purpose, the African slave trade began, breaking slaves to work on lands left vacant after genocide. European ingenuity at work. Just in Mexico, for example, between 1522 and 1650, 100,000 Africans were brought into slavery. In terms of colonialism, the 1600s were dominated by Spain and Portugal. Spain's colonial policy in the 1500s was one of the complete plunder. The strategy was to extract as much precious materials as quickly and brutally as possible. The entire century was dominated by the myth of Edoardo, a city made of gold somewhere in the interior of the continent, just waiting to be found. Europeans named territories based on the riches found there. So, at the mouth of Rio de la Paleta, or the Silver River in Spanish, was the country Argentina, a word that means of silver in Italian. Despite the goldenness, the Spaniards overwhelmingly extracted silver from the Americans under their control. Between 1492 and 1560, 100 tons of gold were sent back to the mother country. But by 1600, 25,000 tons of gold, silver had been sent, 10 times more than the production of all European mines combined. In 1622, a Spanish ship sank carrying a cargo of precious materials and diamonds, estimated today at $400 million. Tales of lost treasures and Aztec gold were born from such transports. In short, the extraction of wealth from distant lands through a combination of genocide and slavery was evidently working very well. So, the rest of the European maritime powers wanted to partake in the discovery adventure. In the first 100 years of colonialism, Spain and Portugal seized Central and South America. Starting in the 1600s, England, France, and Netherlands entered the game of territories that had not existed until then, and began to colonize North America, which remained untouched. Surprisingly, in the 1600s, the seas were dominated by the Netherlands. The Dutch strategy was to establish as many trading outposts around the world as possible, where Dutch traders would exchange goods with the locals. This model was already practiced by Portugal for a century, and the Dutch came and said, "Okay, it's our turn now," and took over the most attractive locations. The Dutch then marked their presence through terrorizing and destroying local populations in the South Africa and especially in Indonesia. Because these were strategic points in their global trade, this trade and colonialism in the 1600s happened through the establishment of the new entities that could be called the world's first corporations. The Dutch East India Company had privileged status, a monopoly on trade with Asia, the right to execute people, establish colonies, and had its own army. At the same time in England, the East India Company was formed, which would have a private army larger than England's, which they used to extract resources from Asia. India only became a British colony after 200 years of terrorism practiced in the region by this private company because in 1857 there was a massive revolt by the Indians. The result of the revolt was that the British Empire had then officially assumed the status of a colonizer, and the state observed the private company. For the African slave trade, the English also had their Royal African Company. How nice that sounds, right? Returning to the Dutch East India Company at its peak in today's money equivalents was worth $7.9 trillion. That means as much as the saving in Germany and Japan combined, today it was by far the most valuable private company that had ever existed, and participants became dramatically richer. From these riches, the Dutch cities of today were built, like Amsterdam and Utrecht, and that's why last December the Dutch Prime Minister said, "Remember all the colonialism and exploitation and the slave trades to build beautiful canals for us to stroll along. Forgive us for that." This moment in Dutch history is called the Golden Age, a time where culture and lovely houses flourished, producing artists like Rembrandt and Vermeer. It is important to underline that this prosperity was not then, nor is now, spread across the entire population. The wealth was concentrated at the top, so it was truly a golden age only for 1% of people. For the rest, it was merely accidental. The story of colonialism in its entirety, it is not about elites who got increasingly wealthy over hundreds of years. Here was born for the first time a true international solidarity among capital holders who discovered that they had a fundamental common interest in making even more money, and therefore the more money they had, the more money had in common. Most populations felt a positive impact from these riches, only incidentally and after many struggles, but more on that later. The Dutch state also benefited from a colony in South America, in the country now called Suriname, then known as Dutch Guinea. To own it, they made a trade with the English, giving them New Netherlands and North America with its new Armstrong, which, after 1664, became New York. Here's the reason why the number of details should be limited, so as not to get lost in the colonialist frenzy. In Suriname, the Dutch brought 300,000 Africans from across the ocean, transformed into slaves, and made to work on sugar plantations. But this was more of an exception. The Dutch were specialized in trafficking of goods and people and in less investing the time needed to establish plantations. Because they had a considerable fleet, the Dutch state benevolently offered to sell slaves to European colonies, regardless of their nationality, thus making a first major emotional cooperation between European countries. If Portugal needed slaves in Brazil or England in the Bahamas, for a small sum, the Netherlands took care of it. Starting from the mid-1600s, the plantation and slavery system gradually but surely became the most attractive domain of the so-called venture capitalism. For a very long time, there was no business more profitable than buying people to work for you for free on lands that did not exist until then, to produce luxury goods from which you could get rich. These luxuries were mainly sugar, tobacco, coffee, and extremely important cotton. The 1700s were dominated by the sugar trade. Essential also became rum, was made from its molasses. And who wouldn't want rum? An English nobleman, a plantation owner, informed his noble brothers at some point that if you have 100 slaves you use for sugar extraction, in 19 years they'll all die. His calculations seemed to be correct. The whole process of converting a plant into usable sugar was very long and complicated, and had to be done quickly, because otherwise the sugar juice would spoil. This work involved not only planting and harvesting, but also the actual processing of the harvest at a record pace and in dangerous ways. So, the whole system was more like a factory, running against the clock. In 1740, the Jamaican, the largest British sugar-producing colony, there were already 100,000 Africans in slavery. Between 1748 and 1288, in 40 years, 1,200 ships brought over 345,000 Africans, and yet a census from 1078 recorded that there were still 226,000 enslaved men, women, and children around the island. In just 50 years, on just one island in the service of producing sugar sold in Europe, over 200,000 people had died. This was the standard pace. These places are known in the history as plantations, but they were in fact forced labor camps that systematically descended Africans. If African people had ever gained enough political power to name incidents from history, this system would have been called the genocide system, not the plantation system, but the history of Western civilization is written with profit from plants. So it remains the plantation system, as that's what interests us here. That's about it for this episode. I will certainly continue with this fascinating and barbaric chapter for colonialism, which, as you've seen, is not what we thought it was. The upcoming videos, in fact, the continuation of this will be very interesting and will now contain things you can't even imagine yet. So, see you soon, and we meet again with the next video.